Sarah Mitchell stood in front of her full-length mirror, adjusting the collar of her cream-colored blazer. Her dark fingers moved swiftly as she fastened the last pearl button, a small smile playing on her lips. Today wasn't just any ordinary Tuesday. It was her 5th wedding anniversary, and she had planned something special for her husband, James. As one of the city's most sought-after interior designers, Sarah usually spent her lunch hours in client meetings or reviewing design plans. But today was different. She was going to surprise James at La Maison, the upscale French restaurant he had bought 3 months ago. Sarah hadn't visited during business hours yet, wanting to give James space to establish himself as the owner without any distractions. The restaurant had been James's dream for years. After working his way up from dishwasher to restaurant manager at various establishments, he had finally saved enough money to buy his own place. When La Maison went up for sale, he jumped at the opportunity, and Sarah had supported him every step of the way. Sarah checked her appearance one final time. Her dark curls were styled perfectly, and her business suit projected the professional image he always maintained. In her line of work, presentation mattered, and she had learned early on that as a black woman in a predominantly white industry, she had to be twice as polished to be taken half as seriously. "Time to go," she whispered to herself, grabbing her designer handbag, a birthday gift from James last year. She walked through their modernly furnished apartment, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors she had personally selected during their home renovation. Every corner of their home reflected her expert eye for design, but more importantly, it told the story of their life together. As Sarah drove through the busy downtown streets, her mind wandered to the day she first met James. It had been at another restaurant, a casual cafe where she was meeting a client. James, then a manager there, had stepped in to handle a complaint at the next table. She had been impressed by his professionalism and the way he diffused the situation with such grace. When he later stopped by to check on her table, they struck up a conversation that lasted well past her client's departure. Pulling into the parking lot of La Maison, Sarah felt a flutter of excitement in her stomach. The restaurant looked beautiful in the early afternoon sun, its elegant French windows and classic architecture a perfect fit for the upscale neighborhood. James had worked hard to maintain its reputation while making subtle improvements to attract a more diverse clientele. Sarah checked her phone. 1:15 p.m. Perfect timing. She knew James would be in his office going over the lunch service reports, a daily routine he had established since taking over. He was always telling her about the small details of running the restaurant, and she loved seeing his face light up when he talked about his plans for the place. Before getting out of her car, Sarah touched the small gift box in her bag. Inside was a pair of vintage cufflinks she had found at an antique store. They were shaped like tiny chef's hats, a perfect blend of elegance and whimsy that matched James's personality perfectly. She hoped he would love them as much as she did. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped out of her car, her natural confidence shining through as she walked toward the restaurant's entrance. A couple of regular customers who recognized her from the grand opening night smiled and waved. She waved back, feeling proud of how much James had accomplished in just 3 months. The maitre d' who usually worked the dinner shift wasn't at his post today. Instead, Sarah noticed an unfamiliar face, a tall, thin waiter she hadn't seen before. He was probably one of the new hires James had mentioned during their conversation last week. As she approached the entrance, Sarah straightened her blazer one last time, excited to surprise her husband and celebrate their love story in the restaurant that represented their shared dreams. Little did she know that this anniversary lunch would become memorable for entirely different reasons. Sarah reached for the door handle of La Maison, but before she could grab it, the tall waiter she had noticed earlier rushed forward to open it. His name tag read Marcus, and while he held the door, his eyes quickly scanned her from head to toe. The smile on his face wasn't welcoming, it was more like a sneer. "Can I help you?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying a tone that suggested she had walked into the wrong place. He positioned himself in the doorway, making it clear that Sarah would have to go through him to enter the restaurant. Sarah maintained her professional composure, something she had mastered over years of dealing with difficult clients. "Yes, I'd like to have lunch," she replied calmly, noting how half the tables in the dining room behind him were empty. Marcus glanced at an imaginary reservation list on his podium. "I'm sorry, but we're fully booked for lunch today. Perhaps you could try the diner down the street." He said this just as a white couple approached the entrance. Without missing a beat, Marcus turned to the couple with a genuine smile. Good afternoon. Welcome to La Maison. Would you prefer a table by the window or in our main dining area? Sarah felt her chest tighten, but she kept her voice steady. Excuse me, but I just heard you offer them a choice of seating when you told me you were fully booked. I can clearly see several empty tables from here. The couple looked uncomfortable, glancing between Sarah and Marcus. The woman opened her mouth as if to say something, but her partner gently pulled her toward the door, and they left quickly. Marcus's face hardened. Listen, I don't want any trouble. La Maison is an exclusive establishment, and we have certain standards to maintain. He emphasized the word exclusive while looking pointedly at Sarah's designer outfit, as if suggesting it must be fake. Sarah took a deep breath, remembering similar situations from her past. She had dealt with prejudice before, both in her design business and in everyday life. But this was different. This was happening in her husband's restaurant, a place that was supposed to represent their shared dreams. I understand this is an exclusive restaurant, Sarah said, her voice clear and controlled. That's exactly why I chose to dine here today. Now, I would appreciate being seated. She stepped forward with determination, leaving Marcus no choice but to move aside or physically block her. Realizing he couldn't refuse without making a scene, Marcus grudgingly picked up a menu. Fine. Follow me. He led her through the elegant dining room, past numerous empty tables with reserved signs that Sarah knew weren't really booked. Instead of seating her at one of the nice tables, Marcus directed her to a small table near the kitchen entrance. The constant swinging of the kitchen door would make for an unpleasant dining experience, and the table itself hadn't been properly set. There was no wine glass or bread plate like she could see on other tables. This is the only table available, Marcus said, practically throwing the menu on the table. I should warn you that our prices reflect our quality. The lunch special starts at $50. He emphasized the price, clearly expecting it to intimidate her. Sarah settled into her chair with grace, smoothing her napkin across her lap as if she didn't notice the poor table location or Marcus's rudeness. Thank you. I'd like to see the wine list as well, please. Marcus's jaw tightened. I'll need to see a credit card first. It's our policy for certain tables. This was a lie. Sarah knew James would never approve such a discriminatory policy. As Marcus walked away to fetch the wine list, Sarah noticed other diners watching the scene unfold. Some looked embarrassed, others angry, and a few simply turned away, pretending not to notice. Through the kitchen door window, she caught a glimpse of Elena, the head chef, watching with a concerned expression. Sarah reached for her phone, tempted to text James about what was happening, but then she stopped herself. No, she would handle this situation her own way. After all, she hadn't become one of the city's top interior designers by letting people's prejudices stop her. Besides, she thought with a hint of sadness, James needed to see for himself what sometimes happened in his restaurant when he wasn't around. Sarah sat at her poorly positioned table, maintaining perfect posture despite the constant whoosh of the kitchen door behind her. Every few seconds, bursts of heated air and the clatter of dishes interrupted the otherwise elegant atmosphere of La Maison. She noticed how Marcus had seated 3 more parties, all white, at premium tables since forcing her to sit here. After making her wait for 15 minutes, Marcus finally returned with the wine list. He held out his hand expectantly. The credit card. His tone was sharp, challenging. Sarah reached into her designer bag and pulled out her black American Express card. She kept her face neutral as she handed it to him, pretending not to notice his look of surprise when he read the name Sarah Mitchell embossed in silver on its surface. I'll need to run this first, Marcus said, his confidence slightly shaken but his prejudice still firmly in place. Just to make sure it's valid. Of course, Sarah replied calmly. While you do that, I'd like a glass of the Chateau Margaux 2015. She named one of the most expensive wines on the list, one that James had specifically imported for the restaurant's collection. Marcus's eyebrows shot up. That's $200 per glass, ma'am. He emphasized the price as if speaking to a child. I'm aware of the price, Sarah said. I'm also aware that it pairs beautifully with your duck confit, which I'll have as my main course. She had heard James praise this pairing many times at home. Marcus disappeared with her card, and Sarah could see him through the kitchen door window, showing it to other staff members and making exaggerated gestures. She took out her phone and quietly began documenting the time and details of each interaction. As an interior designer who often dealt with contractors and vendors, she had learned the importance of keeping detailed records. A few minutes later, Marcus returned with her card and a glass of wine, practically dropping both on the table. "Your card went through," he said, sounding almost disappointed. "Though I should mention that if you're planning to leave a tip, we usually expect 20% for parties in this section." The implication was clear. He assumed she wouldn't know proper tipping etiquette. Sarah took a small sip of her wine, immediately noticing it wasn't the Chateau Margaux she had ordered. Having shared many wine tastings with James, she knew this was likely the house red, about 1/10 of the price. She set the glass down gently. "I believe there's been a mistake," she said. "This isn't the Chateau Margaux." Marcus's face reddened. "Are you suggesting I don't know my wines? I've been working in fine dining for years." His voice was getting louder, drawing attention from nearby tables. "I'm not suggesting anything," Sarah replied evenly. "I'm stating a fact. This is your house red, possibly the Côtes du Rhône. Please bring me what I ordered." A few tables over, an elderly white couple watched the exchange with growing discomfort. The woman leaned over to her husband and whispered something, causing him to shake his head in disgust, though whether at Sarah or Marcus's behavior wasn't clear. Marcus snatched up the wine glass. "I'll have the sommelier verify it," he said through gritted teeth, though Sarah knew La Maison's sommelier didn't start until the dinner service. As he stormed off, Alina, the head chef, pushed through the kitchen doors. She had known Sarah since before James bought the restaurant and had been watching the situation unfold with growing concern. She caught Sarah's eye and raised her eyebrows in a silent question, offering to intervene. Sarah gave her friend a supple shake of her head. She had handled discrimination before, and she would handle it now, with dignity and purpose. Besides, she knew that James usually came down from his office around 2:30 p.m. to check on the lunch service. It was now 2:15. As she waited for Marcus to return, Sarah thought about how this experience, though painful, was highlighting an important issue in her husband's restaurant. Sometimes, she reflected, the most valuable anniversaries weren't the ones filled with celebration, but the ones that brought important truths to light. The tension in La Maison grew thicker as Marcus returned to Sarah's table, this time carrying the correct wine. His hand shook slightly as he placed the glass down, spilling a few drops on the white tablecloth. Sarah noticed he hadn't brought a fresh napkin to wipe up the spill, another small act of disrespect. "Here's your Chateau Margaux," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Though I must say, it's unusual for someone to order such an expensive wine for lunch, alone." He emphasized the last word, trying to make her feel self-conscious about dining by herself. Sarah took a careful sip of the wine, letting its rich flavor rest on her tongue. Yes, this was definitely the correct wine this time. "Thank you, Marcus. I'm ready to order my meal now." Before she could continue, Marcus interrupted her. "Just so you know, we don't serve half portions here." He looked pointedly at her slim figure. "And there's no split plate option if you're planning to share with someone who might join you later." Two businesswomen at a nearby table stopped their conversation, openly staring now at the scene unfolding before them. One of them, wearing a crisp blue suit, reached for her phone and appeared to be recording the interaction. "I'll have the duck confit," Sarah said clearly, aware of the growing audience. "With the seasonal vegetables, not the potatoes." She closed her menu and held it out to Marcus. He didn't take it. Instead, he crossed his arms. "The duck is market price today. That means it's expensive." He paused for effect. "Very expensive." Sarah placed the menu on the table and folded her hands over it. "I'm well aware of the price, Marcus. I'm also aware that the duck confit has been on your regular menu at $65 since the restaurant changed ownership 3 months ago." Marcus's eyes narrowed at her specific knowledge of the menu and its recent changes. "Have you been here before? I don't recall serving you." "No, you haven't served me before," Sarah replied calmly. She glanced at her watch. 2:25 p.m. Just a few more minutes until James would come down for his usual lunch service check. The kitchen door swung open again, and Alina emerged, carrying a basket of fresh bread. She placed it on Sarah's table herself, ignoring Marcus's presence. "Our special sourdough today," she said warmly, though her eyes conveyed an apology for not stepping in sooner. "Made fresh this morning." Marcus glared at Alina's friendly gesture. "I'll get your order started," he said to Sarah, turning sharply and nearly colliding with another server carrying a tray of drinks. As he stalked off, Sarah could hear him muttering under his breath about these people, thinking they could come into establishments like this. His voice was just loud enough for nearby tables to hear, causing several diners to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The woman in the blue suit who had been recording stood up suddenly. "Excuse me," she called out to Marcus. "I'd like to speak to the manager about the service here." Marcus spun around, his face flushed. "Ma'am, I assure you there's no need." "I think there is," the woman interrupted, her voice firm. She looked at Sarah apologetically. "I'm an attorney, and what I've witnessed here today is a clear case of discrimination." The restaurant grew quiet. Even the usual clattering from the kitchen seemed to fade away. Sarah felt all eyes on her, waiting to see how she would respond to this unexpected support. But before she could speak, Marcus rushed back to her table. His previous attempts at fake politeness were gone now, replaced by open hostility. "Listen," he hissed, leaning down close to her ear. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this is an upscale establishment. You clearly don't belong here, and we both know it. Why don't you just leave before this becomes more embarrassing for everyone?" Sarah sat perfectly still, her expression unchanging. Through the corner of her eye, she could see Elena frantically texting someone on her phone. Above them, the sound of footsteps could be heard coming down the stairs from the management office. It was 2:30 p.m., right on schedule. The tension in La Maison grew thicker as Marcus returned to Sarah's table, this time carrying the correct wine. His hand shook slightly as he placed the glass down, spilling a few drops on the white tablecloth. Sarah noticed he hadn't brought a fresh napkin to wipe up the spill, another small act of disrespect. "Here's your Chateau Margaux," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Though I must say, it's unusual for someone to order such an expensive wine for lunch, alone." He emphasized the last word, trying to make her feel self-conscious about dining by herself. Sarah took a careful sip of the wine, letting its rich flavor rest on her tongue. Yes, this was definitely the correct wine this time. "Thank you, Marcus. I'm ready to order my meal now." Before she could continue, Marcus interrupted her. "Just so you know, we don't serve half portions here." He looked pointedly at her slim figure. "And there's no split plate option if you're planning to share with someone who might join you later." Two businesswomen at a nearby table stopped their conversation, openly staring now at the scene unfolding before them. One of them, wearing a crisp blue suit, reached for her phone and appeared to be recording the interaction. "I'll have the duck confit," Sarah said clearly, aware of the growing audience. "With the seasonal vegetables, not the potatoes." She closed her menu and held it out to Marcus. He didn't take it. Instead, he crossed his arms. "The duck is market price today. That means it's expensive." He paused for effect. "Very expensive." Sarah placed the menu on the table and folded her hands over it. "I'm well aware of the price, Marcus. I'm also aware that the duck confit has been on your regular menu at $65 since the restaurant changed ownership 3 months ago." Marcus's eyes narrowed at her specific knowledge of the menu and its recent changes. "Have you been here before? I don't recall serving you." "No, you haven't served me before," Sarah replied calmly. She glanced at her watch. 2:25 p.m. Just a few more minutes until James would come down for his usual lunch service check. The kitchen door swung open again, and Alina emerged, carrying a basket of fresh bread. She placed it on Sarah's table herself, ignoring Marcus's presence. "Our special sourdough today," she said warmly, though her eyes conveyed an apology for not stepping in sooner. "Made fresh this morning." Marcus glared at Alina's friendly gesture. "I'll get your order started," he said to Sarah, turning sharply and nearly colliding with another server carrying a tray of drinks. As he stalked off, Sarah could hear him muttering under his breath about these people, thinking they could come into establishments like this. His voice was just loud enough for nearby tables to hear, causing several diners to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The woman in the blue suit who had been recording stood up suddenly. "Excuse me," she called out to Marcus. "I'd like to speak to the manager about the service here." Marcus spun around, his face flushed. "Ma'am, I assure you there's no need." "I think there is," the woman interrupted, her voice firm. She looked at Sarah apologetically. I'm an attorney, and what I've witnessed here today is a clear case of discrimination. The restaurant grew quiet. Even the usual clattering from the kitchen seemed to fade away. Sarah felt all eyes on her, waiting to see how she would respond to this unexpected support. But before she could speak, Marcus rushed back to her table. His previous attempts at fake politeness were gone now, replaced by open hostility. "Listen," he hissed, leaning down close to her ear. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this is an upscale establishment. You clearly don't belong here, and we both know it. Why don't you just leave before this becomes more embarrassing for everyone?" Sarah sat perfectly still, her expression unchanging. Through the corner of her eye, she could see Elena frantically texting someone on her phone. Above them, the sound of footsteps could be heard coming down the stairs from the management office. It was 2:30 p.m., right on schedule. Elena watched the scene unfolding in her dining room with growing anger. As head chef of La Maison, she had worked alongside James Mitchell for 3 months now, helping him transform the restaurant into something special. She had also grown close to Sarah during their many conversations about restaurant design and menu planning. Now, seeing her friend endure such treatment made her blood boil. From her position near the kitchen, Elena could hear every word Marcus spat at Sarah. She gripped her phone tightly, her thumb hovering over James's number in her contacts. But she knew Sarah well enough to understand why she hadn't called her husband herself. This wasn't just about one racist waiter anymore. This was about exposing a problem that might run deeper in the restaurant's culture. "Chef, the sauce is about to break," one of her line cooks called from the kitchen. Elena nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on Sarah's table. She had hired most of the kitchen staff herself, but the front of house hiring had been handled by the restaurant manager, David. The same David who had brought Marcus on board last week with high praise for his experience at exclusive establishments. Elena moved closer to Sarah's table, pretending to adjust table settings nearby. She could see Sarah's hands trembling slightly as she sipped her wine, though her face remained calm. The lawyer in the blue suit was still standing, her phone recording everything. Other diners had stopped eating entirely, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with one of Elena's chef knives. Marcus had disappeared into the wine cellar, probably to avoid the lawyer's demand to see a manager. Elena knew he would stay down there as long as possible, making a show of selecting wines, while really just hiding from the situation he had created. Taking advantage of his absence, Elena approached Sarah's table again. She placed a small plate of elegant appetizers, golden brown croquettes drizzled with truffle oil, in front of her friend. "On the house," she said warmly, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "One of our most popular dishes. James's favorite, actually." She emphasized the owner's name slightly, watching as several regular customers' eyes widened in recognition. They had seen James and Sarah together at the grand opening. Elena realized. They were finally making the connection. The lawyer lowered her phone slightly. "James? You mean James Mitchell, the owner?" she asked, her eyebrows rising as understanding dawned on her face. Elena just smiled professionally, neither confirming nor denying. It wasn't her place to reveal Sarah's identity. That moment would come soon enough. Instead, she focused on ensuring Sarah had everything she needed while simultaneously sending quick texts to her kitchen staff, warning them to be ready for whatever might happen next. Through the kitchen window, Elena could see her team working efficiently, but stealing glances at the dining room drama. They'd all loved working for James, who had improved their wages and working conditions since taking over. Many of them had met Sarah during her occasional evening visits and knew exactly who she was. Their faces showed the same mix of anger and anticipation that Elena felt. A young busboy approached Elena, wringing his hands nervously. "Chef," he whispered, "Marcus is telling people in the back that he's going to call the police if that woman doesn't leave soon." His voice shook with worry. "He says she's disturbing other customers." Elena straightened her chef's coat, her decision made. While she had respected Sarah's wish to handle things her own way, she couldn't stand by if Marcus was actually planning to escalate things that far. She pulled out her phone again, this time to text James directly. "Need you in the dining room. Now." As she pressed send, she heard the familiar creaking of the office stairs. Elena allowed herself a small smile. She hadn't needed to text after all. James always came down at this time to check on the lunch service. In less than a minute, he would walk through that door and see exactly how one of his employees was treating his wife. Sometimes, Elena thought, the best recipes for change required all the ingredients to come together at exactly the right moment. The heavy oak door leading to the management office opened with a soft creak. James Mitchell stepped into the dining room, adjusting his burgundy tie as he walked. He loved this time of day, checking on the lunch service, talking with customers, and making sure everything in his restaurant ran smoothly. But today, something felt different. The usual gentle murmur of dining conversation had been replaced by an unusual silence. Marcus chose that exact moment to emerge from the wine cellar, his arms full of bottles he didn't need. He was walking quickly, head down, still avoiding the lawyer who had demanded to speak with management. He didn't notice James's presence until he nearly bumped into him. "Mr. Mitchell." Marcus stumbled back, almost dropping the wines. I didn't expect you down yet." His face had gone pale, but he quickly composed himself. "Sir, I was just about to call you. We have a situation with a difficult customer." He gestured vaguely toward Sarah's table, not realizing the connection. James followed Marcus's gesture, his eyes finding Sarah sitting calmly at the table near the kitchen. His wife looked as elegant as ever in her cream blazer, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, a sign he knew well from their years together. Next to her table, Elena stood with her arms crossed, while several customers watched the scene unfold with obvious concern. A difficult customer. James's voice was quiet but carried across the now silent dining room. "Please, explain the situation to me." Marcus, completely misreading his boss's tone, straightened up confidently. "Yes, sir. This woman came in demanding special treatment. She ordered expensive wine, made a scene about the seating, and has been disturbing other diners. I tried to handle it professionally, but..." He trailed off as he noticed James's expression darkening with each word. Before Marcus could continue, Sarah stood up from her table. Her movement was graceful, unhurried. She walked toward James, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. Every eye in the restaurant followed her movement. "Hello, darling," Sarah said warmly, reaching up to straighten James's tie. "Happy anniversary." The color drained completely from Marcus's face as he watched Sarah kiss her husband's cheek. The wine bottles in his arms began to slip, and Elena quickly stepped forward to catch them before they could crash to the floor. "Sarah?" James's voice was thick with emotion as he looked between his wife and his waiter. "What's going on here?" The lawyer in the blue suit stepped forward, her phone still recording. "I can tell you exactly what's been going on, Mr. Mitchell. I've documented everything." She held up her phone. "Your waiter has been harassing your wife for the past hour, making racist comments, and providing discriminatory service." James's hands began to shake slightly, the same way they did when he was trying to control his anger. "Marcus," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "is this true?" Marcus's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. I didn't. I mean, how was I supposed to know she was your wife?" The words tumbled out before he could stop them, only making the situation worse. "How were you supposed to know?" James repeated slowly. "Are you suggesting that your behavior would have been acceptable if she wasn't my wife?" The restaurant remained deathly quiet. Even the kitchen staff had stopped working, gathering at the door to watch. A few regular customers who recognized Sarah from previous evening visits shook their heads in disgust at Marcus's behavior. Sarah placed a gentle hand on her husband's arm. The simple gesture carried years of shared understanding, a reminder that she could handle herself, that this moment was bigger than just them. Marcus looked desperately around the room, but found no sympathy in any face. The reality of what he had done, and to whom he had done it, was finally sinking in. His carefully constructed world of prejudice and privilege was crumbling around him, brought down by his own actions and assumptions. The anniversary surprise Sarah had planned had turned into something entirely different, but as she stood there beside James, she realized that perhaps this revelation was exactly what the restaurant needed. James Mitchell's hands were still shaking as he pulled out a chair at Sarah's table, sitting down heavily. The past 5 minutes had felt like hours as he processed what had happened to his wife in his own restaurant. Sarah sat beside him, her presence calm and steady as always. Marcus stood frozen nearby, his server's apron twisted nervously between his fingers. The lawyer in the blue suit had finally lowered her phone but remained close by, watching intently. Around them, the other diners pretended to return to their meals while stealing glances at the unfolding drama. "You should fire him immediately," One of the regular customers called out, breaking the tense silence. Several others nodded in agreement, but Sarah raised her hand gently. "If I may," she said, her voice clear and controlled, "I'd like to handle this situation." She looked at James, who nodded slowly, trusting his wife's judgment as he had countless times before. Sarah turned to face Marcus, who seemed to shrink under her gaze. "Tell me, Marcus, how long have you worked in the restaurant industry?" 8. 8 years, he stammered, confused by the question. "And in those 8 years, how many times have you treated customers the way you treated me today?" Sarah's question wasn't angry, it was genuine curiosity. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. I don't. "Let me be more specific," Sarah continued. "How many times have you seated people of color near the kitchen? How often have you questioned their ability to pay? How many times have you suggested they might be more comfortable somewhere else?" The dining room grew even quieter. Several servers who had gathered to watch looked down at their feet, perhaps recognizing similar behaviors in themselves. Elena stepped forward from her position near the kitchen. "Sarah, we had no idea this was happening. James has been working so hard to make La Maison welcoming to everyone." "I know," Sarah said softly. "That's exactly why this moment is so important." She turned back to Marcus. "You asked how you were supposed to know I was the owner's wife. The real question is, why should that matter?" James reached for Sarah's hand under the table, squeezing it gently. He knew that look in her eyes. She was turning this horrible situation into a teaching moment, just as she had done so many times in her design career when facing discrimination. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah announced, addressing not just Marcus but the entire restaurant staff who had gathered. "Starting next week, La Maison will implement mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all employees. This isn't just about punishment, it's about education and growth." Marcus blinked in surprise. "You're not firing me?" "That decision isn't mine alone," Sarah replied, glancing at James. "But I believe that simply firing you would solve nothing. The problem isn't just you, Marcus. It's the system that made you think your behavior today was acceptable." The lawyer in the blue suit stepped forward. "Mrs. Mitchell, I have video evidence of clear discrimination. You could take legal action." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, I could. And perhaps that's what I should do." She paused, looking around the restaurant, at the expensive artwork on the walls, the carefully selected wine bottles, the elegant table settings. "But I prefer to build rather than destroy. This restaurant represents my husband's dream, and now it can represent something even more important, real change." James stood up, his decision made. "Marcus, you're suspended without pay for 2 weeks. When you return, you'll be the first to attend our new training program. If you're unwilling to participate, or if anything like this ever happens again, you'll be terminated immediately. Is that clear?" Marcus nodded quickly, relief and shame mixing on his face. "And Marcus?" Sarah added, "I expect you to think hard about what happened here today, about how many other people's special moments you might have ruined with your prejudices, about how it feels to be judged without being known." As Marcus walked away, visibly shaken, Elena began ushering the other staff members back to their positions. The regular service of La Maison needed to continue, even if nothing would ever be quite the same again. Sarah finally reached into her bag and pulled out the small gift box she had brought for their anniversary. "Happy anniversary, James," she said softly. "I think we both received an important gift today." 3 months had passed since that memorable anniversary lunch at La Maison. The restaurant had changed in subtle but important ways. New faces worked among the staff, bringing diversity that better reflected the city's population. The dining room buzzed with conversations in different languages, and guests of all backgrounds felt welcome at its tables. Sarah sat at her usual spot, no longer near the kitchen, but at a comfortable corner table, reviewing the final draft of La Maison's new employee handbook. She had worked with James and a diversity consultant to create it, drawing from her own experiences in the design industry. Her finger traced over the section titled, "Creating an Inclusive Dining Experience." "More tea, Mrs. Mitchell?" Sarah looked up to see Marcus standing by her table. His posture was different now, respectful but not fearful, professional but not artificial. The diversity training had changed him, though not as much as the discussions he'd had with his colleagues during breaks between sessions. "Yes, thank you, Marcus," Sarah replied, She noticed how he poured the tea with steady hands, no longer nervous in her presence. "How was your presentation at the Restaurant Association meeting yesterday?" Marcus placed the teapot down carefully. "It went well. I shared my story, with other restaurant managers. Some of them wanted to know more about our training program." He paused, adjusting his tie. "I never thought I'd be teaching others about inclusion." James appeared from his office, greeting several regular customers as he made his way to Sarah's table. La Maison had become known not just for its excellent French cuisine, but for its welcoming atmosphere. Food critics now praise both the menu and the restaurant's commitment to diversity. "The newspaper reporter just left," James said, sitting down beside his wife. "She's doing a feature on restaurants that are changing the industry's culture. She seemed impressed with what we've accomplished." Sarah smiled, remembering how that difficult anniversary had sparked a transformation. The lawyer who had recorded Marcus's behavior had become a regular customer, often bringing colleagues to discuss business over lunch. She had helped them develop the legal framework for their inclusion policies, which other restaurants were now beginning to adopt. Elena emerged from the kitchen, carrying a special dessert she had created, a delicate chocolate sphere that melted under warm sauce to reveal a colorful interior. "For our agents of change," she said, placing it between Sarah and James. The dessert had become a symbol of La Maison's philosophy, breaking down barriers to reveal beauty within. "Chef," Marcus called from nearby, "Table 12 wants to know if you can make this dessert without nuts." "Of course," Elena replied warmly. "We accommodate all dietary requirements. You know that." She gave Marcus an approving nod, remembering how he had once resisted such special requests. As Sarah and James shared the dessert, they watched their restaurant in action. A young black couple celebrated their engagement at a window table. A Muslim family enjoyed a halal meal specially prepared by Elena. An elderly Chinese businessman hosted a mixed group of clients, all sampling French wines selected by Marcus, who had become quite knowledgeable about pairing wines with diverse palates. "Sometimes," Sarah said softly, "the best anniversaries aren't about celebrating what we have, but discovering what we can become." James squeezed her hand. "You turned a moment of ignorance into a movement for change." Marcus approached their table one last time, carrying an envelope. "The registration forms for next month's training session," he explained. 3 more restaurants want to send their staff." He placed the envelope on the table with pride. What had begun as his punishment had become his purpose. Sarah watched him walk away to greet new customers entering the restaurant. His welcome was genuine, his smile sincere, his service equally professional to everyone. The transformation wasn't perfect. Change never is, but it was real and ongoing. Outside La Maison's windows, the city moved through its everyday rhythm. Inside, a small French restaurant continued its journey of evolution, proving that even the finest establishments could become finer by opening their doors and their hearts to everyone. The chocolate sphere on their dessert plate had melted completely now, its layers of flavor mixing together to create something new and wonderful, just like the restaurant itself.